Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Gallery. My name is Christine Riding, and I'm the head of the Curatorial Department and Curator of British Paintings here at the National Gallery. And today we're going to be looking at Gainsborough's Blue Boy, and Ali will be interpreting on stage as well. So the main reason, of course, for us to be showing the Blue Boy in 2022 is that it's exactly 100 years since the painting left the National Gallery. It was on display in January for 3 weeks in 1922 after having been sold at the end of the 1921 to Henry and Arabella Huntington. And during the display of 3 weeks, some 90,000 people came to see the Blue Boy. Many of them said, in fact, goodbye to the Blue Boy because it was leaving the country, or so everyone thought, for never to return again. And indeed, I'm sure you all know that Charles Holmes, the then director of the National Gallery, scrawled on the stretcher on the back of the painting, au revoir, perhaps suggesting that one day the painting would return, and indeed the painting has. Now, the reason why the painting has come back, because the Huntington Art Collection do not lend the Blue Boy, this is the first time it's been on loan in 100 years, was in part concern perhaps about the condition of the painting, and there's been a huge amount of conservation work, certainly been done more recently at the Huntington. So on one hand we had the return of the Blue Boy here, and you see the black and white photograph on the left hand side with people looking at the Blue Boy, flanked by Hogarth and other Gainsboroughs and so on, British art collections from the National Gallery in 1922, but also that photograph in the centre of the screen that shows the senior conservator at the Huntington, Christina, working on the Blue Boy in the gallery itself. And I think, like other collections like the Rijksmuseum, with the Rembrandt that they're currently conserving in plain sight, as it were, for the public to watch, this entire 2-year conservation project did happen in the public gaze. And I think in part that's many art galleries and museums are very keen to open up in terms of the back of house work that's done in terms of care of collections. But I think it's also an indication that so beloved is the Blue Boy by the audience and public in San Marino on West Coast America, that actually the idea of it being removed from their site for a good 2 years was just too much for most people. I think anyone could bear, hence the very open conservation project that occurred. And in fact, the conservation project itself built on understanding of the painting, a sense that actually, although the painting itself obviously is an 18th century an object, and therefore an old object, could actually travel that long distance from West Coast to London just this once in order for it to be celebrated and enjoyed by people in London, all those in a similar vein to what happened a century ago. So I think the planets aligned, as it were, both in terms of the timing, in terms of the conservation treatment, the willingness of the Huntington to lend it in a unique way, but also coming to the National Gallery itself, which had a relationship with the Blue Boy, albeit briefly, in the first part of 1922. So we've had a number of little celebrations around the arrival of the Blue Boy, not least that we had over 30 little blue boys and girls who turned up for the press launch, which was a really sweet photograph that we actually have on our social media. And I think, having a sort of group of under, I think, 12 or 13-year-olds, and some of them actually were newborn babies practically, with their little ruffs and blue outfits on, sort of underscored the fact that one of the great charms of the Blue Boy as a painting is that it's a painting of youth. And this article in the Daily Mail, which came out at around the same time, tried to unpick why it is that this painting is so famous. Indeed, the word iconic, I know it's used a lot in contemporary culture, but I think the Blue Boy does deserve to be called iconic. Exactly why was this painting so famous? Why has it drawn so much attention over the decades? And they unpicked it in a very neat way for me, actually, because many of the themes that they drew out in terms of what the Blue Boy represents is exactly what I'm going to be talking to you about this afternoon. So the rather enigmatic quality of the Blue Boy that they relate here to the Mona Lisa, the loose locks of doomed youth, the idea of this representative, completely anachronistically, of course, but representative of the doomed youth of the Civil War of the mid-17th century. But as we'll see, there was another doomed youth that the painting was firmly related to in the first part of the 20th century. Then an outfit that's fit for a king, the fact that actually it does relate very closely to the monarchy and the court of Charles I, as well as the illusion of grandeur, this idea of not just the wonderful painting, the painterliness of the Blue Boy in evoking a bygone age, but actually the idea of the conventions of grand manner portraiture, where frankly anybody could be painted in this way. I think the long-lasting nature of the grand manner is the fact that it's so successful in instilling anyone, any sitter, the accoutrements of power, privilege, and in such an innate way that it almost comes from the figure as something that's very natural indeed. And that again was one of the great unique selling points of Anthony van Dyck in particular, was the way that he painted people, not just who he painted. And then the idea of less is more with the background. We'll come on to exactly why, on some level, the Blue Boy was an entirely predictable painting for Gainsborough to have created in 1770. But actually, what did Gainsborough do with this work of art that I think did nail his colours to the mast, particularly in following a Northern European tradition, when many others, like Joshua Reynolds, his great rival, were promoting the notion of French classicism and in particular Italian schools of art. And then finally the idea of the landscape that is forever England, this idea of the Blue Boy evoking some notion of Englishness or Britishness and it becoming a kind of national iconic figure. But finally, I think rather interestingly, is this idea of the hues of blue. The Blue Boy, during analysis in the conservation project, and this is all online, by the way, if you want to have a look, it actually transpires that there isn't just one blue being used here, sort of watered down by whites and other pale colours, but actually multiple blues, multiple different kinds of blues that do give that very particular effect that Gainsborough was looking for in creating this great homage, his greatest homage to Anthony van Dyck. So then just thinking about the moment in 1921 and 1922 when the Blue Boy is sold and then leaves London to go to West Coast America. Henry and Arabella Huntington were extremely wealthy, of course, but also they were very committed and actually I think very interesting collectors. She was just as active as he was, so I think one should view this as a joint acquisition, even though it's often laid at the door of Henry Huntington. And the Huntington Library, Art Museum of Botanical Gardens does underscore these sort of very multiple interests that this couple actually had and the legacy of their gift to the public in terms of the institution that now exists in San Marino. However, they were by no means unique in this kind of buying, this kind of collecting in the late 19th, early 20th century. Indeed, there are many collectors of that period with names who are very familiar to us in the 21st century, the likes of Frick, Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, for example, and the Mellon family are tremendously important in terms of art patronage, both in North America and elsewhere. And Henry Clay Frick, whose collection actually was developed at around the same time as Henry Huntington's. The collection itself, of course, is now in New York. He too bought British art, particularly the Grand Manner, an example on the right-hand side of Francis Duncombe underscoring this onward march of Van Dyck-style costume, or in this particular case, more following the very famous portrait of Rubens' wife, how Gainsborough himself continues to work in this vein, and how it became so appealing as acquisitions in North America. The Francis Duncombe portrait, in fact, was acquired by Henry Clay Frick in 1911, so somewhat in advance of the sale of the Blue Boy. However, this collecting pattern, this passion for British art, and particularly British Grand Manner portraiture, didn't come from nowhere. Certainly, by the time Reynolds and Gainsborough die, Gainsborough dies in 1788, Reynolds in 1792, one can see the development of a very clear direction of travel for British art, and in fact the notion of a British school really coming out of the careers of those two artists and others, and of course the setting up of the Royal Academy in 1768. But it's really the Napoleonic War period, which begins in 1792 and doesn't end until 1815, this sort of, period of extended warfare, but also the promotion of British art, therefore, that comes out of the Napoleonic War period that ends with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. It had already started in the first part of the 19th century through places like the British Institution and so on, really focusing, and the Royal Academy, focusing on those great masters of the previous century as these sort of stalwarts of the British School of Art. So that by the time we get into the 19th century, really there is this very strong promoting of British art as being equal to other European schools of art, and therefore collectors are starting to see this as an opportunity in terms of developing the art market of the period, and indeed the collections that are being either inherited by, let's say, British aristocracy and landed gentry, or partially inherited and then developed, or indeed starting from scratch, as indeed would have been the case with Henry Huntington and other very wealthy Americans, that they are looking to these collections, such as, for example, the Wallace collection in London, very much focused on the Marquesses of Hertford, but particularly the fourth Marquess of Hertford and his illegitimate son, Richard Wallace, who eventually the collection is donated to the public in the latter part of the 19th century. And I have an example here of a wonderful portrait by Gainesborough of a young girl. And then on the right-hand side, those collections that are sort of truly international in the way that, in fact, the Wallace collection was, is Waddesdon Manor, the brainchild of Ferdinand de Rothschild and other members of the Rothschild family, who, by the way, even now continue to add to the displays at Waddesdon Manor. And they also have a preeminent, a rather beautiful collection of boys in satin, not least this wonderful portrait of Gainsborough Dupont, who was the nephew of Gainsborough, in the same Vandyke dress as the Blue Boy. That was a studio prop. So it's something that you do see appearing again and again in a number of portraits by Gainsborough, but we'll come on to that in a moment. But in terms of the exhibition itself, it is not just a moment to sort of marvel at the return of the Blue Boy after 100 years and to think through, well, how on earth did this painting become so famous, and what did it do for the likes of Reynolds and Gainsborough in terms of the unique selling point of British art, both here and abroad, but also looking at the moment that the Blue Boy itself was painted. What did Gainsborough seek to achieve by creating a work of art like that in 1770? So the In Focus display in room 46 looks at two key works by Vandyke that Gainsborough knew intimately. To the left of the Blue Boy on the screen at the National Gallery's own Stewart Brothers, and Gainsborough actually did a full-scale finished copy of this painting in the 1760s, just before the Blue Boy was created. And on the right-hand side, the wonderful Villiers Brothers, which is in the Royal Collection. It's been noted from at least the 1960s by Oliver Miller and others that George Villiers in red on the left is basically the reverse of the Blue Boy to the left of him. So again, two paintings that Gainsborough knew intimately, and what he was really learning from Vandyke was not just the poses and expressions and technique, this bravura technique. I mean, by the 18th century, of course, Vandyke was really seen as the painter's painter, but also the idea of colour management. The wonderful golds and blues juxtaposed in the Stewart Brothers, you can see in the later Lindley Sisters by Gainsborough. And then again in Our Mrs. Siddons on the right-hand side, you can see the wonderful, again, juxtaposition of blue and gold, which almost becomes a kind of motif of people responding to Vandyke in subsequent paintings. So it was the contrast in poses, the contrast in expressions, the fact that a figure tends to look out at you with another one looking away, the brushwork, this effortless quality of social status and wealth, even if the sitter has social status or wealth themselves, is really what Gainesborough was learning and projecting through the example of Vandyke. So that's really what the exhibition does. But it does also indicate the way that Gainesborough isn't just looking at Vandyke, he is also looking at Rubens through landscape, for example. We do have the Watering Place by Rubens and the Watering Place by Gainsborough in our collections. And indeed, Gainsborough himself was fantastically influential on later generations of British art. Indeed, as I said before, by the time Reynolds and Gainsborough had died, there was a new star coming in stage left, and that was Thomas Lawrence, who looked very closely at the example of these two British artists as well as European traditions more broadly. And as you will know, at the end of last year, as a great Christmas present, we thought for everyone coming to the National Gallery, we acquired the so-called Red Boy, Charles William Lambton, a name that undoubtedly, the nickname undoubtedly comes into play in the first part of the 20th century, mirroring the Blue Boy of the famous Blue Boy that had just been sold. And indeed, to make those connections, we've also redisplayed Central Hall at the National Gallery, showing the longevity of the tradition of the Grand Manner, starting with the Renaissance portraits that you can see just out of sight on the left-hand side, moving through the 17th century through the likes of Honthorst, Vandyke and Jordaens. You can see just to the left of the door there on the screen. To the right of the door, of course, Gainsborough's famous Morning Walk, moving through Reynolds' Colonel Tarleton, and Zoffany's portrait of Mrs. Oswald, and then across the door, a wonderful early example of Thomas Gainsborough's work, the portrait of Queen Caroline. And indeed, the portrait of Queen Caroline was very much, by Lawrence, was very much a response to Gainsborough's portrait, which we'll see in a moment. So that sort of sets us up really to think about, well, what was Gainsborough thinking of when he painted the Blue Boy in 1770? He had actually moved to Bath in 1759, and he would stay there for some 15 years. Prior to that, of course, he was born in Sudbury in Suffolk. He had actually practiced in Ipswich and had actually come, importantly, I think, to London and worked in the circle of William Hogarth and others. But we'll come back to that in a moment. The move to Bath is always seen as a critical moment in Gainsborough's career and his ambitions as an artist. Presumably he didn't feel quite ready to come to London to be a physical sort of face-off between him and Joshua Reynolds, who was already established at that point. But he sort of went to one of the other great centres of art patronage, Bath, but also to immerse himself, of course, with collections within Bath and its environs, particularly Wilton House, which we'll come on to in a moment, to immerse himself in the old master tradition, but particularly the examples of the work of Vandyke that he could see there. And I think it's really interesting that he should create the Blue Boy at this moment when he's in Bath. And I think it's particularly interesting to look at the paintings that he submitted for the first annual exhibition of the Royal Academy in 1769, the two examples that you see on the screen, just seeing how he's revving up as a founding member of the Royal Academy, someone who does see himself as the rival of Joshua Reynolds and others, but also really trying to extend his artistic practice to really make an impact on the London contemporary art scene. So we have this wonderful full-length, very grand portrait that's now at the Walker Art Gallery of Isabella Countess Molyneux, very much responding, as I mentioned before, Rubens' wife as well as Vandyke, a very low horizon line that you see in the Blue Boy of 1770, just a year later, idealised landscape, dramatic lighting, this wonderful coolness of the figure in white, black with blue stripes, this very interesting gesture that she makes with her shawl, as it's almost as if it's about to be wrapped around her. Her hair actually very fashionable for the period, but nonetheless, and indeed her dress is entirely cutting-edge fashion for the time, but it definitely is at once a contemporary work of art, but also one that is laden with historic resonances. And of course, the likes of Rubens and particularly Vandyke would have come to people's minds when they stood in front of this work of art. So even the year before the Blue Boy, we can see Gainsborough, as I said, revving up to really embrace the grand manner and very ambitious portraiture. And then on the right, if the portrait of Isabella is reminiscent of the Flemish Northern European tradition, then the one on the right, of course, is very much in the manner of the Dutch. And indeed, Gainsborough, of course, we know his early work as a landscape artist, the wonderful Connaught Wood, very much responding to Dutch 17th century landscape. And indeed, this wonderful little head, I don't know if you've ever seen it in the flesh at Gainsborough's house, which is actually under renovation at the moment, but I'm sure will be opening sometime this year. Wonderful little sketch of a little boy looking up with this wonderful dramatic light on his face as he turns to hand brushes to, we can imagine, Gainsborough himself. So is this a little boy that's nodding towards 17th century Dutch, or is it actually a contemporary work of art? And again, I think with Gainsborough, with these works of art, that's sort of oscillating between, sort of traditions of the past and the present, I think is really what he's trying to get to. And it is a really wonderful painting, and one that some people have actually thought perhaps might be Gainsborough Dupont, the nephew of Gainsborough. I don't think we'll ever know who this little boy is, but certainly someone we imagine that Gainsborough knew where he lived. So then just to say a few words, though, about the London moment for Gainsborough before he goes to Bath in 1759. I do think this is possibly more important than many people have thought, the early London period, and that is immersing himself in the circle of William Hogarth. We all think of Hogarth as the great satirist, but in fact, I hate to tell you, everyone, Hogarth was a great painter. He was a great artist, and he was very interested in art and art of the past and present, and very interested in the materiality of the creation of works of art, not just getting a laugh out of poking fun at the aristocracy and others. And I think a clear indication of what William Hogarth thought about, for example, Vandyke, is that from 1732 in Leicester Fields, now Leicester Square, where many artists and craftsmen lived, he traded under the sign of the Golden Head from 1732, that Golden Head being none other than Vandyke. So Vandyke was very much in Hogarth's mind, as indeed he was with many artists of the period, and even the wonderful Graham children from 1742, which is in the National Gallery's collection, has more recently been described as a response to a very famous portrait of children and young adults by Vandyke, the famous the five eldest children of Charles I. One that was very well known to British artists of the period, and one that, of course, it makes sense if you want to elevate your art and elevate your status within contemporary art, that you would use those kind of models from the past to invigorate the work that you're doing in the present. And I think this is particularly poignant with the Graham children, because Daniel Graham, who commissioned the painting, and by the way, he lived down Pall Mall, and we'll come back to Pall Mall in a moment because that's where Gainsborough lived. He was the royal apothecary and a member of a family of a number of royal apothecaries. So the link to his children and his status and his relationship with the royal family was made, I think, that much more resonant by using a royal portrait by Vandyke to create the Graham children portrait. And the other thing is, of course, is really the circumstances that Gainsborough finds himself in, the kind of patrons there are within London. I'm sure you all know that alongside William Hogarth and many others, Gainsborough actually creates a wonderful landscape that he gifts to the Foundling Hospital alongside many other artists, the one being of the Charterhouse, which is absolutely exquisite little roundel that's still in the collection of the Foundling Museum today. But equally, those people who were sort of circling around the Foundling Hospital, people like Richard Mead, Dr. Richard Mead, was a great collector in his own right, and indeed was visited by the likes of Antoine Watteau, who's a tremendously important French artist of the first part of the 18th century, but he himself owned Watteau's, Richard Mead, and indeed an example on the screen, this very ambitious, large-scale work of art by Watteau was in London in the collection of Richard Mead. And that single figure standing in the centre of that painting, could Gainsborough have seen this work of art? Could he have thought, actually, this is really very powerful to have a figure in a single hue or a single colour? Could it have influenced him? I don't know. But Watteau is a tremendously important painter for this circle. He certainly influenced the likes of William Hogarth and others. But I think it also indicates, perhaps very early on, the relationship between a painting like The Blue Boy and the idea of performance. not just the fact that Vandyke dress was fashionable for masquerades and other forms of entertainment in the 18th century, but also that the act of painting, the artist painting, was often described as a performance of the pencil by reviewers of the period, but also the act of posing for a portrait was itself theatrical and a performance. So I think the melding of these worlds of theatre, of performance, of art, are very much present in the 18th century, and I think that too is something worth thinking about when trying to appraise the impact of the Blue Boy. But I think the other thing that one should remember before we move on from this is that actually we don't know who the Blue Boy is. And in fact, I suspect that Gainsborough is absolutely thrilled at that, and that's probably what he meant. In 1770. We call it a portrait, but is it? It was exhibited as a portrait of a young man because the conventions of the time preferred anonymity to naming the person. But I think Gainsborough used that anonymity. I think it's often been thought to be Jonathan Buttle, who was an early owner of the painting. Well, that doesn't seem to be the case. He certainly would have been too old for a painting painted in the 1770s. And then later it was thought to be Gainsborough Dupont, the nephew of Gainsborough, who I spoke about before. The thing is, though, that Gainsborough Dupont clearly has blue eyes. In fact, blue eyes, I think, is pretty much a family trait for the Gainsboroughs, and the Blue Boy himself has brown eyes. Now, this may not matter. I don't think their face structures look entirely similar, so I think the jury's still out on exactly who the Blue Boy is, but I think the anonymity of it, and I think the idea of it being a kind of performance, something that is not about reality, it's not about giving too much away, but suggesting everything and giving away nothing, that I think actually in part is the power of the Blue Boy going on into the 19th century. And indeed by 1810, it's firmly called the Blue Boy, or even though it might be suggested that Jonathan Buttle is the sitter, but it's the Blue Boy, the title, that is very much attached to this work of art. So this link between theatricality, between Vandyke, Flemish art, and someone like Antoine Watteau, French art, actually ends up being instilled in Gainsborough's art literally from then onwards. It's very difficult, I think, from 1770 onwards to pinpoint a single artistic tradition that Gainsborough is playing with. I think he's really melding all kinds of different styles and inspirations, whether it be French 18th century, whether it be eventually Spanish, Flemish. He really is melding these different worlds together. And indeed, a sort of classic case is the Morning Walk from the 1780s, which on some level is a melding of the Vandyke tradition with that of Antoine Watteau and 18th century French. But I think what Gainsborough does after the Blue Boy is really it's a manifesto work of art, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But I think rather than slipping down the route of pastiche, I think what Gainsborough learned or promoted through the Old Master tradition was the way of actually invigorating contemporary art through examples of the past. Not to slavishly copy the Old Masters, but rather to see them as an exemplar to then launch yourself into different directions. And I think that's particularly important for the way that the 19th century viewed paintings like the Blue Boy. However, we do need to grapple with Van Dyke's influence on Gainsborough and other artists of the period. I mean, certainly the totemic figure of the 17th century for Van Dyke, Charles I and others would have been Titian. In the 18th century, I think it's difficult to find an artist that didn't have more impact than Van Dyke, certainly in portraiture. So what would Gainsborough have seen when he was travelling around outside Bath? Well, one of the things we absolutely know he went to see was this tremendous portrait of the Pembroke family at Wilton House. It's difficult to overestimate really how important this painting was to British art of the 18th century. By some distance, Van Dyke's biggest work of art, but also an incredibly complex one, where the variation in poses and colours and expressions are really just preeminent. And indeed, Gainsborough made a sketch of that particular painting, and I mentioned before the one on the right, the Stuart brothers, which he saw. He made a full-scale copy of that work of art. So he's really getting under the skin of Van Dyke in particular. But there are many examples of British artists responding to the Pembroke family in particular. Just to give you one example, an artist you may not even have heard of, who's a contemporary of William Hogarth, Joseph Highmore, the wonderful Lee family, again from 1736. So we can hardly say that Gainsborough discovered Vandyke. He did not. It's really a question of what did he do with Vandyke, and indeed what did other artists do with Vandyke. So I think it's, given the link that's been made between Gainsborough Dupont, the nephew of Gainsborough, and the Blue Boy, I think it's worth looking just very briefly at family and friends portraiture by Gainsborough at this time. So the 1750s are very important for Gainsborough, just prior and after him moving to Bath. And his family, in particular his daughters Margaret and Mary, are fantastically important in terms of how he starts to develop his artistic practice, working on a bigger scale with brushwork that's becoming increasingly loose and, like Vandyke's, thin layers of paint, glazes, leaving the canvas itself to become a player, as it were, in the finished image. And I think using his daughters and using his nephews allowed him to explore art and the practice of picture making and the painterliness, the process of oil on canvas. Hence the painting on the left-hand side of his daughters chasing a butterfly, which is one of the most popular paintings that we have at the National Gallery, allowed him to extend his art, allowed him to use his dearest relatives to actually really think through the painting. I think what he's doing here, I think, is actually matching the bravura and sketchiness of the actual paintbrush, the brush strokes, with the figures themselves being animated, and one, of course, actually reaching out for the butterfly. This sense of subject, poses, and the process, the actual painterliness of the works of the brushwork, actually being in sort of synergy with each other. And again, he painted his two daughters at least 5 times, actually, as an example on the right-hand side. I don't think I need to say that this is clearly in the manner of Vandyke, both the poses being in different directions, one person looking out at the audience, the wonderful juxtaposition of this white with the blue and then the green under the sculpture on the left. Again, just using his daughters to really explore and extend his artistic practice, revving up, as it were, for that great move to London in 1774. And just to give you some other examples of the portraits of his nephews, on the left we saw the one from Waddesdon Manor, and then in the centre, Gainsborough Dupont again in the Tate's collection, again wearing the same Vandyke dress, and then Edward Gardner on the right-hand side, also in the Tate's collection, again wearing this Vandyke dress, again very close relatives, using them to really think through how he was going to move his art forward. So, Vandyke, of course, was a fantastic painter, the painter's painter of the 17th century. He was, of course, knighted by Charles I, so his status and position was something to really focus on in terms of British artists wanting to achieve the same thing for British art the following century. And of course, the images that he created of the court of Charles I really are, just preeminent, and just there's many of them. They are, they just exude this sense of insouciance and glamour and just a kind of natural quality of leadership and wealth and status that just really is very, very seductive. And I think undoubtedly the work that Vandyke did when he came to London from 1632, he'd been in London before, but this is one of his more permanent stays, 1632, he dies in 1641, really did transform the way that British art and culture actually viewed portraiture. But it's not just that, it's not just about Charles Vandyke as a great painter and achieving the kind of position that people could only dream of. Just thinking about it, the first British-born artist to be knighted was James Thornhill in the first part of the 18th century, and then Joshua Reynolds in the 1760s. So he wasn't exactly coming along like, one bus after another in terms of knighthoods for British-born artists. This was something they really wanted to aspire to. And in the 18th century, of course, very few were knighted, but even so, it was something to aspire to. But it's also what Vandyke actually represented in the round. He wasn't just a great painter, he was a great linguist, a bit like Rubens, he had a kind of international profile. He was also a collector and a patron in his own right, and he also went on grand tours. So he was very sophisticated, a great connoisseur, and indeed as a collector I think it is very important to remember the kind of works of art that he had in his house in London. So for example, we're really fortunate that the Vanderman family by Titian in the National Gallery's collection was once owned by Vandyke, and indeed Perseus and Andromeda in the Wallace collection was also owned by Vandyke too. So he, in the round, I mean, he really was a fantastic sort of exemplar for what British artists thought they might be able to achieve. So it's exactly this kind of I think sometimes people think that people dressed up in Vandyke dress is sort of like a supreme act of fluffiness and sort of, superficiality. But it's much more than that. Certainly when men are dressed in Vandyke dress, I mean, I can accept that maybe with women who were sort of much less expected to be intellectual and thinking people. But, for men, this was really quite a statement. So, for example, the portrait of Thomas Cook on the left-hand side, he's in Vandyke dress. He has a dog that sort of reminds one of King Charles Spaniel, so he's getting the accoutrements together to suggest that he's sort of almost a time traveller from the court of Charles I. But there's columns, there's classical sculpture, there's views through to what, to Rome and other, the Roman Campagna, to suggest that this man has been on the grand tour, but also to link him through those accoutrements, through the specific costume of Vandyke, to the connoisseurship of the 17th century, to the court of Charles I, to the artist Vandyke, who in the round was this great exemplar. So this isn't just about dressing up, this is actually aligning yourself with the kind of connoisseurship and patronage and elevated culture that the 17th century came to represent. And then the painting in the centre of Joshua Reynolds. So this is painted just before the formation of the Royal Academy in 1767. This painting's dated by Angelica Kauffman, who actually is a founding member of the Royal Academy. Here we have Joshua Reynolds in Vandyke dress. He has a bust of Michelangelo, the divine Michelangelo in the background, and on the table strewn with periodicals and journals and all kinds of indications of his intellectual stature and interests as a budding president of the Royal Academy. And then we have the Blue Boy on the right-hand side, painted within 3 years, stripped of everything in terms of anything other than the Vandyke dress. In fact, I've described this as a declaration of independence, really, in terms of the accoutrements of the intellectual, cultured lifestyle that you can see being played out on the paintings in the centre and to the left. So is Gainsborough saying, I'm not going to follow the route that Joshua Reynolds keeps banging on about with the British School of Art, the Royal Academy, and the way we're all going to be told to go down this route and do this and do that. I'm going to do something a little bit different. So perhaps what the Blue Boy actually represents is perhaps not just an alternative Northern European focus for British art perhaps, but also an artist very early on in the early days of the Royal Academy actually being independent and going his own way and making a declaration as such in only the second Royal Academy exhibition that had ever been held. So Gainsborough does eventually move to London in 1774. He's really established himself during the 15 years he was in Bath. He's exhibited at the Royal Academy, including the Blue Boy in 1770, and now he's ready within 4 years to make that move. And the house that he actually sets himself up in is a 17th century house called Schomburgk House, which still exists. You can see the photograph lower right. And I think geography, as ever, is probably almost as important as artistic influence. Schomburgk House on Pall Mall is literally just down the road from St James's Palace, a palace that was associated in the 17th century with the youths of the royal family. It's where the children often lived when the adults were in, the king and queen were in Whitehall Palace. So it had that relationship, and it's literally just, 200 yards from Schomburgk House. And then looking over into St James's Park, of course, we have Buckingham House, the future Buckingham Palace. So these portraits aren't just in the royal collection, they're actually in the area that Gainsborough now lives in from 1774 with the Blue Boy and with his copies of Vandyke and other old master paintings. And during this period, of course, as it probably is, indeed it is the case in the 21st century, artist studios are semi-public spaces. This is where you would, of course, go if you were about to be painted. It would be where you go and have a look at the recent works of art created by artists. Eventually, Gainesville, when he falls out with the Royal Academy, he uses his house to exhibit his works of art and not at the Royal Academy itself. So it was very much a centre for the artist to show off. And as you came through the door, one can imagine there's the Blue Boy, literally down the road from other very famous Van Dykes. And I think that's very poignant, I think, and very, very deliberate. But perhaps now is the moment to mention, although it was never made public, that Gainsborough's wife, Margaret, was in fact the illegitimate and only daughter of the 3rd Duke of Beaufort. So in fact, it was entirely legitimate on some level for Gainsborough to perhaps suggest his aristocratic links, even if he couldn't publicly proclaim them. And of course, there aren't many British artists who could make that kind of claim in the 18th century. So what's actually being shown at Buckingham House, the future Buckingham Palace? Well, Johann Zoffany, for example, this painting here on the left-hand side, showing the Villiers brothers on the wall on the left, and indeed another portrait of Van Dyke of the 3 eldest children of Charles I above the fireplace, and then 2 portraits of members of the royal family, George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte. So, and the 2 children, of course, sitting in front. Now, this, of course, could, you could dismiss as a bit of whimsy, but actually I think there's much more going on here in terms of George III, who came to the throne only in 1760. And I think this is where we start seeing the issues around, for example, the Jacobite rebellion of 1745, the Battle of Culloden in 1746, and to remind ourselves that actually the Blue Boy was exhibited, 14 years after the Battle of Culloden? This is near memory. This is something that's very much alive. And indeed, the tensions that happened within the royal family, within British art and society, that produced the Civil War and then the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and then numerous Jacobite rebellions in the first part of the 18th century, doesn't actually really firmly resolve itself until the end of the century, although the Battle of Culloden does look like the beginning of the end. George III, I think, is really saying, I'm bringing the 2 sides of this crisis together. George III, of course, was born in Britain. He spoke English as his first language, and he was a direct descendant of Charles I's sister Elizabeth. So even though people bang on about the senior and junior branches of the Stuart dynasty, he was a direct descendant of James I, 6th of Scotland. So I think this kind of imagery isn't just about dressing up. So the image on the right-hand side, the group painting of George III, his queen and his children in Van Dyke dress, could be dismissed as just simply a dressing up portrait, but actually I think for the time, 1765, I think it's a very important, 1770 is a very important image for the royal family to project. And indeed, it was exhibited at the Royal Academy at the same time as the Blue Boy. So if, in exhibiting the Blue Boy in 1770, Gainsborough was trying to suggest to members of the royal family and indeed members of the aristocracy that he was the man for them, I think it does really come to fruition in the 1780s for Gainsborough as far as the royal family is concerned. Although he himself doesn't actually achieve the status of a knight in the manner of Joshua Reynolds, I think in every other sense he was, if not the favoured artist of that period, he certainly was one of the most favoured artists, not least in terms of the commissions that he got, including this wonderful group portrait of the entire royal family. And indeed it continues with other commissions, for example, what was originally a full length of the 3 daughters, again relating it, of course, to the 3 children of Charles I, and then on the right-hand side, his portrait from 1781 of Queen Charlotte, which is the portrait that Lawrence, of course, responded to with his own painting of the Queen, which is now in the National Gallery's collection. So in the last part of this talk, I just wanted to very quickly whip through some ideas about the onward march and impact of both the Stuart dynasty, but also the idea of the Blue Boy going through the 19th century. Undoubtedly, the outcome, the legacy and so on of the Jacobite rebellions, of this kind of romanticisation and historicism that is very much a key part of the 19th century does come through with the very famous painting, When Did You Last See Your Father?, where a little blue boy is seen standing in front of one of Cromwell's men. And indeed, even in the 1892 painting by Petty of Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart, coming into Holyrood, is there a relationship between that and the blue boy? Or portraits by Vandyke, of course, including that of the future Charles II, who's standing looking full frontal. I think that's, if not quite a smoking gun, I think it's pretty close. But equally, the Blue Boy did actually not just about sort of historicism and a kind of nostalgia and looking to the past, whether it be pre-industrial or indeed the idea of a court culture that perhaps many people felt needed to be revived under, and indeed was under Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. There is also this thing about the Blue Boy, I think, as a kind of painter's painting. I think the way that it's talked about, the legends that accrue around it, particularly this idea of the dominance of blue in a painting, which was set up as a kind of rival, again, a kind of a riposte that Gainsborough created in 1770 in order to refute Joshua Reynolds' comments about the colour management in the painting, that blue and other cool colours could not dominate a canvas. Those kind of colours had to be in the periphery, and the warmer colours had to dominate in the centre. Now, the timings don't quite work because Joshua Reynolds actually made those comments in 1778, so sometime after the Blue Boy was painted. But it does set up the potential that the Blue Boy and other paintings like it, where blue is such a dominant colour, was actually the paintings that he had in mind when he made his comments, Joshua Reynolds, I mean, in 1778. And I do think that the idea of a painting that's identified through a colour and the anonymity of the sitter could and was, I'm sure, more than a hint to artists in the 19th century about the direction of travel that they could take their own art in. And I think the aesthetic movement and artists like Frederick Leighton and this wonderful portrait of May Sartoris, which seems to be a sort of an amalgamation of Vandyke with the Blue Boy to create this wonderful work of art from 1860, I think it was more than a hint as to how one could use colour, anonymity, and the conventions of historical art in order to create art in the present. I think that's particularly true of John Everett Millais, a renowned pre-Raphaelite artist, but had a very definite aesthetic movement moment in the 1860s, again nodding to the 18th century as well as Vandyke. So again, the 17th and 18th century almost come together, as it were, into the 19th century through such portraits. And again, I would just make some comment. I have no smoking gun here, except to say that Whistler, who is a fascinating figure all by himself, because he too, a bit like Gainsborough, often had rows with the establishment, the artistic establishment. He went to the Art Treasures exhibition, where the Blue Boy literally was centre stage in the central hall of an entire exhibition with hundreds and hundreds of works of art in it, and came away and perhaps thought through maybe the catalogue that talked again about this rivalry between Reynolds and Gainsborough and the colour blue. Did he come away and sort of think, actually, there's something in this? And within years, of course, creates a whole series around the Blue Girl. And in fact, although not completed, actually created his own Blue Girl series. And indeed, at least one of his friends and biographers actually said, I think what he had in mind was the Blue Boy. So again, I just think a little bit like Gainsborough using Vandyke, what we have here is the likes of Whistler, Millais and Leighton using the example of something like the Blue Boy to really explore and extend their own artistic practice. But finally, I just wanted to talk through really the very specific moment that the Blue Boy is sold in 1921, and perhaps explain in part the great public outpouring of grief almost that came with the sale of the Blue Boy and it leaving. Undoubtedly, I think it having happened within, 3 years of the end of the First World War, when so much is actually going on in the area of London in terms of commemoration. In 1920, of course, in Armistice Day, we have the permanent setting up of the cenotaph on Whitehall, which also happened at the same time as the interment of the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, a single person representing all those who had died on the Western Front and elsewhere across the globe. So I think there is something there in this single figure that really provoked a response that perhaps might not have happened had the Blue Boy been sold at any other time. This wonderful memorial at Paddington, of course, by Jagger. I've forgotten his first two names. Oh, Charles Sergeant Jagger, which actually was unveiled in November of 1922. So at the end of the year that the Blue Boy actually left the country, the Great Western Railway lost 25,000 workers in the First World War. And this image here shows you the unveiling of that memorial at the time. So I think it's a very specific moment, I think, where this outpouring occurred, where people talked about the lost youth. Again, this idea of they've lost so much already in the First World War and now someone else is leaving us, perhaps permanently, might explain why there was so much emotional outpouring at the time. But I think the Blue Boy, we can see other sort of cultural resonances, social resonances in the 20th and 21st century, which I think is really important for the lifeblood of a work of art, that it doesn't die literally, but becomes still a life force for artists and for everyone else. I personally wonder if Peter Blake, wasn't making a bit of a joke about a middle-aged bloke dressed in blue in front of a fence that's actually broken with a sort of idyllic landscape in the background, wasn't making a bit of a joke about juxtaposing it himself almost with this glorious youth that's represented in the Blue Boy. And indeed, Kehinde Wiley has created a work of art for the Huntington for the 100th anniversary of buying the Blue Boy by Henry Huntington, by actually creating a work of art that actually comments on the way that the Blue Boy itself. The thing I mentioned about the anonymity of the Blue Boy, Kehinde, who grew up in Los Angeles, you may know Kehinde because he did the portrait of Barack Obama, and we've currently got the exhibition on at the National Gallery. He grew up in Los Angeles, went to the Huntington, stood in front of the Blue Boy and said, "I can't relate to this aristocratic imagery." However, if the Blue Boy is Gainsborough Dupont, he's the son of a carpenter. So what Kehinde's responding to, the sort of aristocratic, the suggestion of aristocracy in the image, is exactly what Gainsborough, I think, was playing with in 1770. So I think that sort of gorgeous relay race between artists in terms of what works of art, how they operate, I think is really, really interesting. And Kehinde's, of course, his practice is to really bring people into the centre who would normally be seen in the margins or not be represented at all. So he too looks at issues of absence, but also the idea of using the conventions of the grand manner and other forms of art to actually redress the absence of people, as he would say, like me. So my last slide, I mean, I had my birthday on Sunday, so I'm even less of a spring chicken than I was on Saturday. So I have some feeling for Boris Johnson being represented as the Blue Boy, as indeed he has twice actually, once in September and once more recently. However, I think, without any comment on Boris Johnson himself with his exploding red outfit here, I think the reason why this is funny or humorous has to be because the Blue Boy itself is famous. I always think that the work of art's finally arrived if it's a pub sign or a cartoon, and I think the Blue Boy may have been both. But I think that's the power of that image, is the fact that it's so familiar, it can actually form part of contemporary satire. Thank you.